And we're going to turn it over to David van Driessche from FourPees is going to talk to us a lot more about X4 and users. So, all yours.
Thank you very much. And like I said, I'll try to keep it to an hour, which means we can go to lunch on time, which is always important. Let's start this off by highlighting some of the things I've been doing and which could explain why I'm doing this in the first place. I'm actually a physicist by training, which is kind of weird, but anyway. I happened to do a bunch of stuff with PostScript first of all, and then moved along on the whole PDF train with Pitstop. Ended up with an organization called Ghent Workgroup, which you're going to see come back in the talk. I've been technical officer there, documentation officer, vice chair. I think I'm now marketing officer. It's kind of
you don't know.
It's kind of easy to get jobs there. I think I am now, but there is an election coming up, so I have to think about that. I did a few years around automation with Gradual, developing Switch. Ended up back with Enfocus through acquisitions. And I'm now working at FourPees doing a bunch of things where users perhaps get much more involved than in some of the previous development work I've been doing at these other companies, which makes the whole thing a lot more interesting, not necessarily easier. So I want to preface this by saying that I am actually very much in favor of the PDF X4 standard, which might not be obvious from some of the other stuff I'll be talking about, so I'll just put that up front there. I think this is a really big step forward when you compare it to some of the other stuff we had to work with. It also brings with it a number of quite serious challenges, and while I focus on some of the more technical challenges, the business ones are probably even better or even bigger in some cases. So while I think the standard is good and it allows for some pretty nifty stuff, there is in fact a whole ecosystem around it consisting of users and the software that they use and the hardware that they have to use. And that whole ecosystem at the moment isn't exactly where it should be to take full advantage of that PDF X4 standard. So why do I say that? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. And it's only examples, and I'm sure there are very good technical explanations for all of it. But I'll be a user, and as a user, I don't really care about the technical explanation. I just want this stuff to work. And actually, the previous session kind of made my point for me to some extent, so I'm very happy with that. Together with someone from Sonoma who happens to be in one of the subcommittees of the Ghent Workgroup, we did a little bit of investigation into mobile devices and stuff like that, and we started playing around with InDesign. And we took a file that was prepared, a production file that was prepared for print production, and we decided that we wanted an RGB PDF out of that for various reasons.
What do you mean by export RGB?
We saved it as, we used PDF settings that said, I want RGB.
So you're converting everything to
Oh, we're very naive at this point.
Okay.
We want RGB.
Okay,
So.
naive user. Okay,
Yeah, I'm a naive.
Very naive.
Of course.
Okay.
No, I just said what I want. I want RGB. So I put this thing to RGB. What comes up is this dialog box, first of all.
Which is nice.
Which is nice.
Not understandable, but
It
nice.
contains. Yeah. I used some transparency to take away the production file that I didn't want to show. But this is like 6 lines of explanation, and most users will click OK because that's then it goes away.
No, first thing, don't show again.
So I'm not so naive because we actually got this one.
It comes back, that's the problem. Next time you start, it comes back.
So if you read it, it doesn't help much. Because if you read the whole thing, it starts talking about, well, you have it talks about destination color space with a U, which is weird because I have a US version of anyway. It talks about the export Adobe PDF settings and a destination color space. And I can imagine something with that because I did select RGB for that. So then it talks about transparency blend space, and now I'm totally lost. I have no clue what this is. And it's different. But when I continue reading, I'm kind of it's comforting because it says you might have some color appearance changes. And we were actually interested in overprint, so I don't care about the color. So we just did okay anyway. What we ended up with, and this is not totally accurate, I took some screenshots from another file to show the same result. I could show this one. What we wanted was this. We have an object in the InDesign file that is set to overprint, and we wanted to see something overprint and then test whether it works on mobile devices and stuff. So this is what we wanted. This is actually what we got. Now, I remember reading something on that dialog box about color changes, but that's slightly more than a color change to me. So we were totally confused. Again, I'm sure there are all kinds of good technical reasons, and I don't want to diminish InDesign or what it does. I'm just saying that as a user, this whole transparency and overprint and it can get pretty confusing, and then we complain about it.
But that rendering in the result was taken from the tablet.
No, this is not the actual file. This is a different screenshot, but it shows what we got in the actual file. But I could show this one. I couldn't show the original production file.
Now you actually, rather than using a standard PDF X4 thing, you created your own, is that correct? Your own job options?
I do not know. I think we took I'm not going to say what we did. I don't know.
Not going to go take the PDF X4 job options and change them explicitly to create totally RGB based PDF X4.
No, but I'm a very good naive user. I just took something and changed it to RGB. I don't know what I took.
My point was, you didn't just take what was there and use it. You actually went and mucked around with it.
Yeah, because I wanted RGB, so I opened it up, which it lets me do, and changed it to RGB.
Well, the point is, though, is that you actually went out of your way to produce this.
Oh, yeah, because I wanted RGB. So yes, I agree.
You get what you deserve.
Got what you deserve.
So that's the conclusion you're getting at, right? Well, I'm the problem, apparently. So, okay.
For users, this would be a whole lot easier, I think.
I'll give you that. So, if users are the problem, let's look at software. And like I said, the previous presentation kind of made my point already. If you have a room full of experts and they don't agree upon what it should be, then there is something wrong. Or there is something very complicated anyway. So software. Transparency has been, and this is a point that has been made by other people as well, so I'm not being original here, but this stuff has been around for a long time. We're talking originally PDF 1.4, which is Acrobat 5, which is
2001, give or take.
I would have thought 99, but yeah,
Yeah,
you probably know better. So PDF X4 has been around for a bit now as well, as a published standard, and even before for anyone who cared. So maybe the users aren't okay, but the software should be okay. Now, I'm not going to repeat any of the stuff that you've seen about preview and some of the results of the Autono technical suite there for the other tools, which kind of hints to the fact that maybe not all software is completely okay with all of these new features. I do want to talk a little bit about an actual production suite. And this is one I can take a little bit more blame for, so it's easier to talk about that one. Print Factory is a large format production RIP that has its own, it's not built on an Adobe RIP, it has its own implementation. And they actually tell people that they can use PDF X4 files and color managed files, and it should all work very well. You can see some subtle differences. It's not as horrible as preview, perhaps, and I actually didn't find that many problems in the Autono technical suite, but still, you see, like here, there's supposed to be some red here, and that kind of disappeared, and there are some other subtle differences. So let's take one that is a little less subtle. I think there should be something here, and this doesn't exactly match what is there as well. So the problems aren't always very, very subtle to begin with. If you print that on a 2 by 10 meter piece of textile, it's going to cost you a lot of time and money. The same for the transparency patches, where you see all of the different, the things that should be the same and that aren't. So again, more or less, you can call that subtle, I guess. This one kind of annoyed me because if you look at them, they're largely the same, except that there is something here that isn't there. So there is actually a character that got dropped. And while many of the color changes are something that you can very easily spot when you open the Print Factory editor and you see this thing before you, you immediately see that something is wrong. This one would be easy to miss. So I'm kind of annoyed by that one. So this is obviously a very good standard, but it's not necessarily an easy to implement standard. I think that's a fair statement. I hear people say that everything is documented and it's not rocket science, and it isn't. It's still pretty hard to implement, and there is still some ambiguity over what it should be and what all the fine details should be. So why do we make things so difficult? I mean, we have stuff that works, so why would you go to something like PDF X4 and want to implement that? What's the real world advantage? I want to talk about two kind of use cases, if you want, where I got involved a little bit. One is PDF for mobile devices, and another one is PDF for packaging. Let's do the mobile one first. So again, and now we go back to why I was mucking around with those InDesign files that didn't work. What we wanted to do was take a native document, the question we wanted to answer, and this comes back to a whole discussion we have in the Gantt work group in one of the committees there. What we want to do is take a native document and export the best possible PDF for use on a mobile device. I have the iPad here, since that's supposed to be like 99% of the market anyway. But it could be something else. I just want to export a PDF. I don't want to go to an image. I know I can. I don't want to do EPUB or anything else. I want to do a PDF. And why? Because it is done today. There are people that are doing distribution of files as a PDF file. And whether that's smart or not is something completely different, and I don't want to raise any kind of opinion about that. But it is done today, so we thought, let's look at how you should be able to do that. The second case, and this was mentioned already, it's not because you tell people that they shouldn't do something that they don't end up doing it. So if you talk to, for example, publishers and you ask them what they see in practice, what they see is that they send files to people to prove, to say whether they are good or not good. And they will open them on their iPad and they will say, well, this is not good. And the problem is not the file, the problem is that particular person using an iPad and not using a good application on their Mac or PC. But people do it. So can we export a PDF file that will minimize the risk in those particular use cases? And by the way, I state this in minimizing risks. You already know what the answer is, more or less. But there are two main methods we explored and we kind of looked at. And again, we didn't go the route of, for example, taking that PDF and rendering it into an image. That would be a different exercise altogether. What we said is, well, one thing we could do is make something that is PDF X1A or very similar. The other route, the more modern route, would be, let's make a PDF X4 and use that, because it's supposed to be better for those kinds of applications. So in PDF X1A, of course, you're looking at something that is CMYK and spot, and where all of the transparencies have been flattened. On the other side, you're looking at something that has, well, we weren't really sure about color, and there were some heated discussions about whether you want to convert stuff to RGB or not, and all of those. But you're definitely looking at live transparencies, and potentially you're looking at the use of all of these other modern features that are allowed in PDF X4. So, which of the two? Well, we did some experimentation there. First route, PDF X1A. One of the things that you immediately mentioned, and again, this is just one example, but I'm including it anyway. This is a folder with 50 production files. The total size there is 97 megabytes or something around that. This is the same folder of production files that has been flattened, and the total size is 240 megabytes. So flattening a file in many cases will make the file larger than the original. It will definitely make the file more complex than the original because you're flattening it and you're introducing all kinds of difficult structures to reproduce what that live transparency did in the first place. Why do we care about that? Well, we care about that because if you look on the web and you look at what people search for or how people find readers on mobile devices, all of those readers are concerned with how quickly does the PDF open, how quickly does it render. So those characteristics are things that people take into account to choose what they will use as a reader and whether a reader is good or not good. Speed is obviously a very important thing that people are interested in, at least the people writing the reviews are interested in. And interestingly, or not, unfortunately, the only mention of Adobe Reader I found in all of the top 20 reviews that I read was one saying that the Adobe Reader isn't very good because it doesn't have many features, right? They're not concerned about quality of PDF. They're concerned about how quickly does my PDF open on this device. And the ones that opens it up first and displays something on screen wins. Who cares about the quality of what they show? The bigger problem is not the size and the complexity of the file. The bigger problem is what is called the white line problem, which means that if you flatten the file and you look at it on a mobile device, depending on the resolution and the reader itself, perhaps, you have a chance of seeing small white lines appear where different objects, different elements of the file that have been flattened touch each other. And at that resolution, they don't completely touch, so there is a white line in between. You don't see it in the original, you do see it in the PDFX1A file on the device. And that's really, that last problem is a deal killer. I mean, seeing an ad on a mobile device, for example, where you see that kind of artifact on top of the ad is something that publishers will never accept as something that is good enough.
But the reason is not because they don't touch, the reason is because anti-aliasing tries to hide that there are two objects.
Correct. So in reality, they do touch if you look at the file itself, but the way it's rendered screws it up. And it's not limited to the mobile devices. You can see it on screen. You can even see it in print sometimes. But it is very apparent on mobile devices. So maybe PDFX1A is not a very good choice for this, which, well, means that we have to look at the other option. And the other option would be, let's look at PDFX4. We don't have to flatten transparency, so we don't run into the problem of the file getting bigger. We don't run into the problem of the file getting more complex and thus rendering slower. We keep our transparency, so we don't have the white lines. It's all great. This is what the thing was made for, so perfect. And I have to make a small detour here, because we used something to test for the use of PDFX4 that I have to explain what it is if you don't know about it before I can actually go there. We could probably have used the Autono test suite patches to do some of this as well. What we chose to use instead is the output suite of the Gantt work group. And the output suite consists of a number of test patches that test individual features of PDF. There are patches for overprint, there are patches for fonts, there are patches for all kinds of individual features. But each patch tries to focus on one specific feature so that you can very easily see whether a particular feature is supported and is supported well by the actual device you're looking at, or the reader you're looking at, or the workflow application you're looking at. It was designed for easy scoring, and I'll show you an example of what I mean with that. And it was initially focused on PDFX1A because all of the Gantt workgroup profiles are PDFX1A++. plus profiles. So it focused on the features used for PDFX1A. There are already a number of patches under development for PDFX4. If you look on the website, what is downloadable is still the PDFX1A version, but some of that work has been done. So we included those beta patches in the whole set. The patches look very simple. You have something that either looks good or doesn't look good. And everywhere where you see a big cross appear means that that particular feature is not supported or is not supported correctly. So preview doesn't do much with spot to CMYK overprint in this particular case, because that's what the patch is about. And then you have all of the different possible elements in a PDF, so it uses that spot to CMYK overprint for fonts, vectors, images, masks, and shadings. Makes it very easy to look at these patches on a device and see what works and what doesn't work. Because if we're going to export a PDFX4 file and use that on a device, we do want to know what works on that device and what doesn't work. So we did some of that research, which is a lot of fun, because you have to open all of these patches up on the different devices and in the different readers and see whether they work or not. And the end result of that is this. We obviously had too much time on our hands. What you're looking at is a spreadsheet where you have applications here, you have the actual device that was used, so we did most of the testing on iPad. There are also Samsung Galaxy in here, and there is a Motorola Zoom device in here. And then you have the different output patches and the category they belong to. So basically a bunch of overprint, a bunch of, this is font, shade, output intent, and so on. And to make it easy, everything that is green is supported, everything that is red is not supported. And there is kind of like more red than green in this table. So there are some that perform slightly better than others. There are some differences. What you see in general, and I'll have some summary of this so you don't have to try and read this, but what you see in general is that most of the devices, especially on iPad, for example, they just use whatever Apple gives them in terms of PDF rendering, so you get the same consistently bad result for all of them. Right? So let's draw some conclusions out of that. Overprint is simply not supported. Done. No one supports it. Output intents are typically not supported, and color management in general. I mean, if you're looking at the iPad or any of the other devices to get accurate color, forget it. It's not going to work. Optional content is supported by almost no one, which means that everything is shown in the document. Whether you have stuff that is on layers that are hidden or not, they don't care. They show everything. Many of the Android readers don't like transparency. I sympathize with that, but it's still unfortunate. JPEG 2000 is not supported. I say not supported. It's actually supported for CMYK. In many cases, it's not supported for RGB content in the same case. So the JPEG 2000 RGB patch actually fails. The CMYK patch goes through for whatever reason. 16-bit images not supported, device N not supported. So it turns out that many of those features that we're looking for in PDFX4 that would be great to use are actually not usable because none of the readers support it. And of course, this is a highly volatile market segment, and things change, and tomorrow it could be different than today. But when we did this test with the latest version of the operating systems on those devices, this is what we got. This is the current situation. So I've basically said that PDFX1A is probably not a very good idea. I've basically said PDFX4 is not a very good idea. So what options do you have? Well, there are a couple of different things that are under discussion. There is no real conclusion here, which is good. But there are a number of different things that are being discussed. The first one is a technique that is applied by some, which is basically partial rasterization. Meaning that you take a document, you split it apart, you keep all of the text live, and you rasterize everything else. So you make the background image basically of the vector and the image elements, and then you put the live text back on top. The advantage is that you keep very crisp text in the document. You're not doing transparency flattening in the traditional sense of the word, so you're not going to end up with those problems. You're not increasing the complexity of the file all that much, quite the opposite actually in some cases. But obviously this also has disadvantages. First of all, it's not going to work for just any document, because if text would be behind some of these images or vector elements, if you're looking at complex pages, this is not guaranteed to work in that sense. Also, you're rasterizing the background image, and that means you're going to have to rasterize it at a certain resolution. And unfortunately, not all of the devices have the same resolution. And then do you want to allow people to zoom in on that device, which means something different again for resolution. So it's not perfect. I'm just saying that this is a technique I've heard discussed and seen demonstrated by people as a solution instead of using just PDFX1A or PDFX4. The second option, and perhaps the one with the highest chance of success, if you want, is to create a PDFX4 file. So still take the PDFX4 route and use that as a base format. And then say, okay, let's look at those features that are not supported, and let's not allow those in the file that we are going to use on that device. Just as for print production, again, workgroup settings, for example, say start with PDFX1A and then have pre-flight checks for a number of things that will not work in that particular market segment. You could do the same thing here. And we could do things like even fixing the file and do things like removing hidden optional content, because we know if we don't completely remove it, the device is going to show it, and that's not what we want. You could convert images that are not supported. You could simply fail those things that we can't fix and that we don't want in the file because we know that it's going to be a problem. So at least then either you will get a file that will work, or you will be warned that this particular file will not work. It's not a stupid approach to look at. The biggest problem in that is overprint. The fact that overprint is not supported is kind of an annoying thing, and it's very hard to get around. We've done some research on that as well, and there seems to be some indications that it might not be as big of a problem as initially thought. One of the tests we did with Sonoma in Belgium is look at a whole bunch of production files and see why overprint was used. And secondly, if you look at that file on a mobile device and there is no overprint capability in that device, would that actually make a difference visually for the file? And what we found in all of those production files, at least, is that in 99% of the cases, overprint is used for black text, and that's it. So avoiding misregistration and stuff like that. Now, visually on a device that doesn't do overprint, that doesn't change anything. So
as you don't do flattening of transparency, and suddenly you get white overprint.
yeah, but it's a PDFX4 file, so we're not flattening anything.
Unless you have imported some ads which are delivered in X-4.
Correct, absolutely correct. Now, before I get to that, let me finish the list here. Willechta did the same thing. They actually use, which is another of the big publishers and printers in Belgium, they actually use PDF in production, with production files, to go to mobile devices for quite a while, and they have seen virtually no problems with overprint on their end. And then there was some feedback from Adobe, from Dove, if I remember correctly, that essentially gives the same kind of reading. So it might not be that big a problem in the end.
Did you try to put two iPads on top of each other?
And overprinting?
Yeah.
Their transparency model doesn't work that way.
But they do get hot.
They get very hot. That is multiplied.
Put a piece of bread between two iPads. You're toast.
The other thing to remember is that something like this can actually be detected in a pretty nice way if you set up a good workflow. I mean, if I take a file, a production file, And that's where the original screenshot comes from, which is why I said it's not the production file I tested for that one. But if you take this kind of file where this is the view with that green rectangle in overprint, and this would be the view when that green rectangle is put in knockout, not an overprint, those two can very easily be compared, and you see that there is going to be a visual difference in that particular case. So, and that's what we did for the Sonoma test. We actually ran a preflight profile that switched off overprint in all of these files, and then we did a visual comparison between the before and the after image, which shows you that in most cases it's simply the font or the text that are set to overprint, and it's not a problem. So, given the fact that overprint is perhaps not as much a problem as it was thought to be, also given the fact that you could build a smart workflow where you detect potential problems and you could have someone look at those files and see whether it's going to be a problem or not, taking the PDF X4 route seems to be the more likely candidate to generate something that makes sense on a mobile device. And what the work group of the Ghent work group is doing right now, the committee there, is coming up with export settings for InDesign that will take an InDesign file and create a PDF X4 plus file that has the highest chance of surviving unchanged on a mobile device. I'm doing good. So much for that. PDF for packaging, something completely different. There is another subcommittee in the Ghent work group that is looking at PDF X4 for use in packaging. There are today already specifications for the use of PDF in packaging, but the packaging subcommittee has always been a little bit of an outstander, an alien in this group, because all of the work of the Ghent work group is based on PDF X1A, except for packaging, because they simply needed too many features that weren't available in PDF X1A, so they kind of always did their own thing. Today, PDF X4 would...
Maybe they know something.
Today they're looking at PDF X4 because that does contain all of the stuff that they need. I don't want to talk about the whole work of creating a standard or specification for packaging. I want to focus on one single detail. One of the things that they are very interested in is creating what they call a digital master of a file, which is one PDF file, to rule them all, I guess, but one PDF file that can be used in their, at least, proofing workflow, and that can go to everyone who is involved in typically a very large group of people that have to look at that file and comment and approve and whatever. And where you use optional content to show a view of that document that makes sense to that particular person in the workflow. To make that more concrete, if I make a design of, and I actually don't remember whether I have a slide for that. Yes, I do. If we assume that this is the production guy, and it's actually not a printing press, but the image is not big enough for you to see that anyway. If we presume that this is a production guy, what he will be looking at in most cases will be the design itself, and then all of the technical information around that. And in this particular case, he's even looking at you see the color change between those two here. That is because there is a varnish on top that is transparent and it shows where that varnish is going to be rendered and so on. So all of the content is here, but all of that content is very nicely put into optional content, so that if I, at another place in the workflow, for example, the nice marketing guy, if that guy looks at the file, what he sees is the part of that particular design that he understands, and he might not understand all of these cutting and creasing lines, and he might not understand that his color looks different because there is a fake varnish representation on top of it, and he might not care about all of this stuff that you have at the bottom. So we could simply switch that optional content out and leave in those parts that make sense for him. So that's kind of the goal. You want one PDF file where, depending on who's looking at it, I can show either this or this view or something else still, maybe only the text if it goes to legal, or the text and dimensions if it goes to legal, because they have to know how big different elements are and so on. PDF X4 gives you a very nice way of dealing with that. This is like a serious presentation. I mean, it gives you a very nice way to deal with that, right? So, which of those have to do with optional content?
All except the last one.
The first one is actually obsessive compulsive disorder, and you have to be that or have that a little bit if you want to understand all the rest of it. OCD as an abbreviation is not used in the spec as far as I've seen. There is an optional content dictionary, but it's actually called OC instead of OCD, which is kind of confusing, but oh well. OCG is like the basic, well, I have some explanation of all of this, so I shouldn't give away all of the good stuff here, but optional content group, which definitely has to do with optional content, and then you have optional content configuration dictionary, so the dictionary part is included here. It's not very consistent.
Well, that was a PDFX. The OCCD and OCM, those abbreviations are actually not in the PDF spec. They were shortened specifically in X4.
So it's
I'm guessing because Martin didn't like to spell them out.
It's Martin's fault.
It's Martin's fault.
We'll keep it to that. That's fine with me. OCMD also has to do with optional content, and it's optional content membership dictionary. And don't worry, I will talk about all of those and explain you in detail what they are before lunch.
Tomorrow. I feel like lunch after that.
You might not. And the last one, as Stefan already is, well, that's kind of the reaction when you get through all of it. So, the basic thing here is the OCG. And OCG stands for Optional Content Group, and that is the way to subdivide the content into things that perhaps are optional and you could switch on or off. And what you see here is a screen grab from PDF Toolbox where you see the names of all of the optional content groups in that particular document. All right, there's a whole bunch of them. Which is not uncommon, which is very common, let's put it the other way around, in files for packaging or other workflows like large format production and stuff like that. You typically find all of those things in there. An OCG has a name, which is the name you see in the user interface. It can have an intent, like view or design, and it can have a usage dict. And that usage dict can be used to specify when that particular OCG should be visible. But the OCG by itself doesn't state whether it is visible or not. So it simply says, I'm a piece of optional content, and then if you look at the actual content of the page, that content will reference one of those OCGs to say, well, the content that follows now is part of this particular OCG. So on the one hand, you have a definition somewhere of all of the different optional content groups in the document. And on the other hand, if you look at the page content, that page content can tell that it is part of one of those optional content groups. And in many cases, OCGs are spoken about as layers. I mean, if you remember the screenshot from PDF Toolbox, the name that is used there is layer. If you talk to packaging people about that, they get totally confused because layers for them are spot colors, or it's something that refers to Z orders, so that it's stacked on top of each other. And actually, OCGs have nothing to do with that. If this is the order of elements in a page, I can perfectly well state that all of the texts should be part of an OCG called text, and all of the images should be part of an OCG that is called images. And whatever order they are in, or whether there are other elements in between there,
Nobody cares.
doesn't matter. But if you talk about layers, the perception is that it's always going to be things that are stacked on top of each other. So layers by itself is kind of a confusing name for that feature. The next building block is an OCCD. An OCCD, optional content configuration, thank you, dictionary. A document can contain multiple of those OCCDs, as many as you want, I think. And an OCCD can determine whether or which OCGs are visible and which ones are not visible. And I'll give you an example in a second. At the same time, the document must have a default OCCD, and that's the one that determines which layers are visible. I always say layer as well, but I should say OCG. Which OCGs are visible when you open the document initially, right? So when I open a document, this is what I should see. The OCGs that are in the state as defined by the default OCCD. So if I said that layers are not supported on mobile devices, that's what basically that means. The mobile device reader doesn't look at the default OCCD and just shows everything. It skips everything that has to do with optional content. It's easier that way. Looking at the same file and the same screenshot, but now the complete screenshot out of PDF Toolbox, you see the connection between those two. This is still the list of all of the optional content groups in the document. And you can see that some of those are switched off or visible, well, switched off or not visible, and switched on or visible, right? And I could individually switch layers if I'm looking at the file. However, what you see at the top here are the OCCDs. What is called layer views by PDF Toolbox are the OCCDs. So those are combinations of visibility and invisibility states of these layers at the bottom. The idea, of course, is that if I switch on the marketing OCCD, and this happens to be the default OCCD in this particular file, then the marketing view is what I see. Switching this on tells the, make sure that all of the non-marketing information, of the non-marketing layers are switched off. If I would go to production, I would get that other view where you see all of the information, including the varnish on top of it and everything, and the marks and the legend at the bottom and all of that stuff. Right? So think of OCCDs as logical groupings of OCGs. A logical way to, or different views on that same file. And why would you use that? Well, there are a number of very obvious uses for that technology. The last one here is the packaging one that I talked about. Different people in a workflow might need to view a document in a different way, and this allows them to do that in a very nice way. The other possible use is regional workflows. I have stuff where, for example, the price is different depending on the region, a geographical region that file is going to be used in. It's an ad, and depending on where I print it, I might show Swiss francs or euros. Multiple language configurations, and we're in a very good country for that. I come from another one. Same file, I have 2 or 3 or 4 different languages that I have in there. Much of the content is going to be the same, but the text will be in the file in different languages. And depending on who's looking at the file, they might want to look at the French version or the English version or the German or the Dutch or whatever. So there are definitely very good use cases of that combination of OCGs and then OCCDs to make those logical groupings. And then we have OCMD, and OCMD, Optional Content Membership Dictionary. And the difference between the OCCD and the OCMD is that in an OCCD, all you say is, I'm going to tell you which of those layers are on and which of those layers are off. It's a very simple metaphor. With OCMD, you can do all kinds of much more complex rules. So you could show an element if multiple layers are not visible, or if one of them is visible, or if none of them is visible. And there is a whole language in there to determine what the visibility statement should be of a particular object based on the OCGs in the document, based on other things like application state, zoom factor, and all of those things.
So they just to reiterate, the OCMD is a superset of the OCCD.
It's more complex, yes.
Okay.
Same thing,
It's a,
both true. Difficulties. If you read this whole system, then this is perfect for what you need in packaging. However, there are still a number of pitfalls and reasons it's not exactly used like that in packaging today. And I'll go over all of those, of course. First of all, if you remember the picture of the OCGs, those OCGs, if you think about their properties, they have a property that is the name of the OCG. And that name of the OCG is also what is shown typically in the user interface of the software. So if I'm a Belgian designer of packages, probably chocolate boxes or something like that, then I might put an OCG in there that is called snellen, because that happens to be the Dutch word for a cut contour or whatever you want to call it in your local language. So what you end up with is a bunch of OCGs, a bunch of layers that every designer names differently. And of course you can try to standardize that by having a big whip and standing behind your designers and trying to make them do the right thing. In practice, however, that doesn't work all that well. What would be much nicer is having metadata in that OCG that further defines what that particular OCG is. So then I can call it whatever I want. The metadata would still allow me to find out what that particular layer is used for. And that is very important when you think of packaging workflows where you want to do automation. I want to have an automated workflow where I open up the file and where I, in an automated way, throw out all of the technical information. Now, how do I know that a particular layer is a technical layer? Well, today the only way to do that would be to have a big dictionary of everything a technical layer could be called by any of my designers. It sounds stupid, but if you go to packaging prepress companies, it's exactly what they do. Even worse, they do it with spot colors today. But anyway, they have an idea of, they want to do something special with varnish at some point. Well, they know that there are 41 different names that their designers are using to identify, that all really mean varnish. And they will actually run checks to see whether the spot color is named any of those 41 different possibilities. It would be kind of nicer if you think about this optional content, that we don't start doing the same thing, but that we use metadata to identify those. The packaging subcommittee and the Gantt work group is actually working on a standardization along those lines, where they would allow you to continue to use whatever name for the OCG you want to use, but they would add additional metadata to the OCGs that identifies what they are. So solvable, not solved today, but solvable. Software support, and that actually goes back to the previous point again as well. It's not because something is there in the language or in the specification that it's necessarily implemented by software. There tends to be a little bit of a time span in between specifications and an actual implementation in software. And what you see is that there is pretty good support for stuff like OCGs and so on. And I'm not talking about rendering support. I'm not talking about the fact that you have software that opens up that file and does the right thing in terms of displaying the file with default settings. That's kind of a baseline, and you have to if you implement PDF X4. What I'm talking about is that something like Acrobat, just to give an example, makes it very easy to switch layers on or off, so you can change the visibility of layers. PDF Toolbox, for example, allows you to switch layers on and off, but also layer views, OCCDs. So that goes a little further. But that's about where it is, and it's all on the viewing side. If you look at the creation side, and if you look at creation software, whether it's in packaging or anywhere else, that can put in those OCCDs, for example, and going back to the first point, that could put in that metadata that you need to identify the OCGs. We're definitely not there at this point.
So that statement at the bottom is not correct.
Yeah, I would also say, because last time, remembering in Ghent, I showed the OCMD thing, which at least in Acrobat 10 was, you were able to access this information.
Yeah, OCMDs have been properly supported by Acrobat since we implemented optional content.
Not by Acrobat 9. OCMD
In some cases, yes.
refuses to
For a
but
PDF,
Acrobat 8 shows the information.
for a PDF X4, Acrobat 9 does not show the OCMDs but that's because it was implementing X4 2008, which according to the 2008, you couldn't use OCMDs in the way you can now in 2010, and so Acrobat 10 implements X4 2010 with respect to OCMDs. So remember, we changed the X4 spec in between as well, guys.
Which complicates matters.
No argument, but I just wanted to make
Yeah,
sure,
so
but I wanted to put it on the layer that we were following the spec, not,
Let me put one other thing on the table. OCGs are supported by the JavaScript implementation in Acrobat, for example, and in
Yes.
Reader.
Yep.
The rest of the stuff isn't, which is kind of annoying.
Yeah, to be honest, because up until X4, there was never a use case for it. But, and actually, our authoring tools do also author OCMDs, but they do not author OCCDs.
Which further complicates matters, but yeah.
And it's also an ongoing argument between Olaf and myself, because he likes OCCDs and I don't.
Yeah, I'm not going to start that
Yeah,
one.
don't go.
So further to my point, and I'll take your comments into consideration for that one. You can show me later where it is.
But no, that statement was right. We don't do JavaScript in
Yeah.
those. You can't have JavaScript in X4, so it's okay. Anyway, sorry.
Spot colors versus, and one more detail point, just to highlight some of the difficulties that you run into when you start thinking about that. OCGs provide object level granularity. So basically you look at the page content, and for different objects you say, this is part of this OCG, this is part of another OCG, and so on. Traditionally in packaging, they didn't use OCGs, and they don't still today in most cases. And they use spot colors, and that means that you don't have an OCG called varnish, you have a spot color called varnish. And the same with many of these other things that they use. Now, the spot color can provide actually more granularity than what an OCG can provide. And the annoying thing that you run into is that, for example, you could have something that uses CMYK or anything else in terms of spot color as a design element, like an image that is in the file, but that also has a spot color varnish in the definition of that. And that is possible because you can do device N, where you have all of those different colorants in there. Now, there is no way to make only the CMYK content visible on the marketing layer, but not show the varnish on the marketing layer, because they're part of the same object, and it's either in that OCG or it's not in that OCG. So you face some problems with that, and there are probably solutions for all of these things. But it's not a matter of simply taking what they have today, which is perhaps awkward, but works with spot colors, and then flipping a switch and saying, from this point on, we're going to do the same thing with OCG and everything is nice. It has to be thought through a little bit more than that.
And the varnish problem, as you and I have talked about, is a much larger problem.
Oh yeah, and I totally agree with that. And that gives me, well, 5 more minutes for questions.